All right, so welcome everyone to our officially first episode of our podcast. It's called Salon, and Salon is again an Arabic term for basically a room in your house where you sit together with your friends and discuss important topics, cultural topics, scientific topics, any discussion you want to have once a week. So today I'm very, very delighted to have a very special guest with us on this episode. And this guest, we have been colleagues and friends for so many years. He is Dr. Philip Montgomery. Dr. Philip has experience in teaching Spanish language and Spanish language education in the US, and also English for academic purposes in Kazakhstan. He earned his master's in education policy from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the US, and also his PhD in second language studies from Michigan State University. His research interests revolve around, critical language policy, English medium instruction, and language ideologies. So, and he is also a multilingual speaker. He speaks English, Spanish, and Russian, as far as I know. So I would like to welcome Dr. Philip Montgomery. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, so we're so happy to have you with us on this episode, and we would like to learn from you a little bit more about a new approach that has been, spreading around in the English or language learning, field that is called CLIL. So I'll give you the floor to talk to us about what is CLIL and what is it used for?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the question and for the invitation to talk to you all. I got my introduction to CLIL in Kazakhstan, where I was an academic English instructor, and it was being used to train local teachers to manage a multilingual curriculum, which had a focus on English, Russian, and Kazakh, which is a lot to manage. You can imagine as a teacher, not knowing how to prioritize or what to prioritize in terms of balancing different languages. And a big trend was to teach content courses like biology or mathematics in one of those languages. And so the idea of CLIL, which we should probably spell out, stands for Content Language Integrated Learning. The idea is to balance content instruction with language instruction. And so it really sits at an intersection between those two aims. It kind of started in immersion programs in Canada. So a lot of these areas of the world that are very multilingual. So French and English are commonly taught in Canada. And really important emphasis on creating a bilingual or multilingual society means embedding and enmeshing different languages in an educational setting. It was coined in the 1990s in Europe, and was kind of like it shot up in the late 90s in terms of popularity in Europe because they were trying to establish this framework of mother tongue plus two. They wanted everybody to be trilingual. You should have your own language, but you should have a language of commerce, a language of travel, a language of community. And so the languages are kind of interchangeable. It doesn't matter which languages you want to throw into those slots. But the focus is to teach a content course like any social studies or history, but then to do it in another language other than the student's L1. And so it really started as a way to balance heritage languages and community languages in the classroom But more recently, it's been spreading to be a way to teach English in places where English is not a dominant language. So it might not be a lingua franca, but it is a language of economic capital, social capital. And so a lot of governments are looking at how can we teach English without adding more courses? How do you embed language into content courses? And so there are a lot of models to do that, and CLIL is in some ways an umbrella term that encompasses some very more specific ways to teach content and language at the same time.
Oh, thank you so much for this kind of, I know it's brief, overview of CLIL, but my question to you is how is CLIL different from other terms? You mentioned that it's kind of an umbrella term. So I heard other terms like content-based instruction and English as medium instruction, so CBI and EMI. How is CLIL different from those terms?
Yeah, I think all of them have the principle of supporting additive bilingualism. The idea being that you can, bilingualism doesn't have to mean losing some other language. You can add a language and to maintain other languages kind of in a symbiosis and a positive, mutually beneficial relationship. And so CLIL, if we say that the focus of CLIL is to balance language and content, that means in a classroom you've got learning outcomes. So you have a syllabus or you have a curriculum, and it has course outcomes, learning outcomes, specifically about the content, but also specifically about language. It has that both. It's kind of the key ingredient of a CLIL model. If you look at something like EMI, you've got a program more focused on the content. You have an English medium of instruction. For example, a university where I was working in Kazakhstan, for example, might have a class or a whole curriculum for engineering, and it's in English. But the course aims are all just engineering. It's just content focused. And so the language is the medium of instruction, but it's not the target of instruction. And so that EMI, the M is really important there. It's a medium, it's a vehicle for instruction, but it's not scaffolded, it's not focused on. And one of the big complaints about teachers trying to work in EMI settings is that they don't have enough support, or the student's proficiency is too low. And so there's not enough scaffolding built in to actually raise the proficiency of students on their way up to being able to access content material through the language. And so you might see CLIL as a bit more supportive of language development, more intentional focus on language instruction than EMI, which says do the content but do it in English and doesn't pay very much instructional attention to language curricular goals. CBI is interesting because it's content-based instruction, which usually happens in language classrooms, right? So you have a language classroom and they say, well, how many of our students are really bored with studying grammar all day long? Like a lot of language classrooms, and I taught this in the high school Spanish class that I taught for several years. The textbook was very grammar heavy. It was a grammar-based syllabus that went from present simple to present progressive to past simple to past perfect, and it progressively got more complicated following the grammatical structures that are moving from more frequently to less frequently used. And so the topics were based on what grammar was being used, and it felt very artificial. And content-based instruction says, no, 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 don't focus on the language as a scaffolding or as an organizing principle for the course. Use the content, have them, like TBLT is another kind of acronym in this world. So task-based language teaching that focuses on real-world tasks, real-world interactions. And so CBI is let's do something like it's a language class, but we're going to do something physical, do something project-based, do something very meaningful that gives some purpose to using the language, not just studying the language for the purpose of the structure of the language. I mean, I think you can probably relate, like how many students of yours want to be linguists? Not very many, right? I'm interested in language as a teacher. That's why I'm interested in language with my students, not so much. And so if I treat teaching like, well, I'm going to tell you how the language works. We're going to pick apart, talk about the differences between derivational and inflectional affixes. their eyes start to glaze over. They say, why do I
Right.
need any of this? But if I
Boring.
say, exactly, boring, like what a nerd. Why are you interested in that? But if we say we're going to design a vacation package to go to this place and we're going to do it all in this other language, you have a challenge, you have constraints, you have creativity, you have problem solving, and then the language allows that all to happen. And so that's content-based instruction, which is very similar to CLIL, right? But the biggest difference I would say is that CBI happens in language classrooms. And so it's like we do too much on language and we need to balance it towards content. CLIL is the idea of taking a content course and saying, oh, we need to balance it towards language, right? So those are very, very close cousins on either extreme. So if you put it on a spectrum, you might have CLIL and CBI are kind of in the middle. EMI is out on kind of the language or on the content extreme, and EAP, right? English for academic purposes, is all about language, but maybe not as much about content. So it's a language-based course, more on extreme. So we can think about them as kind of a spectrum. And some people would say CLIL is on the spectrum, and other people say CLIL describes the spectrum, right? That idea of an umbrella term of how balanced are content and language learning outcomes in a curriculum.
Mhm. That's what I was thinking about actually when you were speaking about the spectrum and where to place CLIL and the other terms, CBI and EMI. And it seems like CLIL is like in the middle of this spectrum. It's kind of both the content focused and language focused. They're and for teachers, they have language objectives and content objectives. For learners, they come to class to learn the content and also to learn the language. So yeah, that's very good to know. And this kind of paves the way for my next question. What makes CLIL as an approach to learn language appealing to learners? So instead of, how many of your students just come to class saying, oh, I want to learn English or I want to learn Spanish. And this is kind of their main objective, learning a language. And
Mm-hmm.
this makes us use very, as you mentioned, grammar-driven or grammar-oriented textbooks that are kind of outdated, I would say, and they don't serve the communicative nature of the language itself. So when you go on the streets and you try to communicate with people in Spanish or in English, uh, I mean, you don't really think, oh, is it present simple? Is it present continuous?
Mm-hmm.
You just communicate a message, and you hope this message comes across to the recipient or the other person, and they understand you basically. So what makes CLIL more appealing to learners than just a general English course?
Yeah. Um, it's an interesting question. And I think I completely agree. Students want to be able to use a language. If they're focused on a course, taking a language course, the ability to use it, to perform it, to be proficient in social settings for real world tasks, is essential. I think that CLIL, like I said before, CLIL is as I understand it. I mean, I have some experience, but wouldn't say I'm a world expert on CLIL. But I don't think that CLIL is necessarily um, an add-on for a language class, right? Like language classes already focus on if you're saying that if they're taking a grammar-based focus, a move towards content-based instruction is a benefit. And I would say that, so the idea of, I'm not saying CLIL is a benefit, but I'm saying the idea of balancing language content, language curriculum, and content curriculum learning outcomes. The benefit is that you're doing something real in the classroom. You're doing something meaningful. You are designing something. Say, for example, if you're in an English class and it's grammar focus, a CLIL approach would say, well, what are you doing it for? And so English isn't the focus, right? It's a balanced focus with some content. So you need some real topics. It needs to be about architecture. It needs to be about art. It needs to be about design. It needs to be about history. It needs an actual content focus. And that can potentially get students more involved and more, engaged with doing something that they might already be interested in. Say, for example, talking about music or talking about geography of the world. Those can be more interesting, depending on how they're taught. They can be more interesting than just looking at a structure and use of a language. But I say that it's not really an add-on for a content course because usually CLIL is really beneficial when it's a content course that's already taught in English. And people are saying, well, why are we doing this? How are we doing this? So the EMI model that's common in universities is kind of throwing students into the deep end and saying, you have to take a, medical history class, but it's going to be in English. And the motivation for that is political. It is a national government trying to push international competition and economic resources and things like that, that don't support the students who say, well, maybe I don't need that. Like, where's the interest and what's the support for learning this content in a new language? And so CLIL has the biggest benefit, I think, not about adding content to language courses, which is beneficial, but it's adding language support to content courses, right? So it kind of depends on which direction you're coming from. If you're a teacher in a classroom that already has a language focus, adding content will add variety and meaningfulness to your class. If you're in a classroom that's content heavy, that it doesn't have a language focus, you're risking not supporting your students to gain the proficiency that they need to be able to succeed in your class. It's really, really popular in the EU because they say, we get two for the price of one. We get the content and we get the language, right?
Mhm.
And so from a national or international level, CLIL is a nice diplomatic approach to balancing languages.
Mhm.
And the content needs of a curriculum that happens. So if you think at that macro scale, it's good for students because they're getting both. They're getting their curriculum, but not having to go to extra classes. They're getting the language, but not having to sacrifice, talking about something interesting. So you get to do both of those if it's done well. And that can be a challenge, of course.
I agree, and I think the core term that we can dedicate the CLIL from what you just mentioned is the idea of generating interest on the end of the students. So students come if it's a CLIL course or like the content is already decided. This is a history course. It's going to be taught in English, for example. So the focus will be on history and on language. So students will come to this class already motivated to learn the content because they basically kind of chose to sign up for this course to learn about history in English or in other languages. So the interest is there, the motivation is there. So I think this is a benefit for CLIL that students already come to your class interested in the content, opposed to other like content-based instruction where you have your units around a specific. Each unit focuses on a specific content. Uh, Not all students might be interested in this content, right? So we're talking about traveling this time. We're talking about economics. We're talking about tourism. Well, not everyone will be interested in all contents that you cover, but for CLIL, my understanding, I might be wrong, is that students already chose this content
Mhm.
and they are interested in learning it. And of course, you give scaffolding for the language that you use to learn this content. So at the end of the day, there is a big language outcome coming out of this course, and it's in a content that students are interested in as well, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think an important distinction is about choice, because you're talking about driving student engagement, is the level at which the students are encountering this. So secondary school students might not have very much choice over their schedule, and they have this state curriculum. So that's why I think it's helpful to think about when you talk about CLIL, it's hard to separate it out from national aims about what kinds of society are trying to be produced through the schools, and that those are important debates that are ongoing. At the university level, right, as students get older, they do opt into a track or a major, a specialization, and that drives their interests. And if English or some other language, I mean, like I said before, it can be any combination of languages. If there's another language that's kind of imposed on that curriculum, students can feel like, oh, well, I'm interested in the content, but the language is kind of getting in the way. And so CLIL reminds teachers and trainers of teachers to scaffold the language instruction to not lose the students. So it goes both ways. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think it's a nuanced point about the level of student engagement and the differing contexts in which they may be left behind, right? They may be ignored because the teacher thinks everybody wants to learn about, the present perfect progressive, right? Isn't that interesting, kids? And they're like, no, that's not interesting. And the teacher does it anyway. So students could be left out that way. Or at a kind of other extreme, they're interested in the content, but the language is imposed on them. You have to do this in English. And say, why do I have to do this in English? I'm not interested in English. I want to be a doctor, and I don't think I'm going to use English with my patients. Why do I need it? And so that tension exists, and it's something really, I mean, that's where I get motivated to learn more about how then teachers can kind of navigate those different tensions and account for what their students need, what the curriculum is telling them to do, and then what they themselves feel confident and comfortable to do.
Yeah. This brings us to, I think, the last question I have for you about it's kind of what you already mentioned at the end. What are some of the challenges that might face learners and teachers when deciding to teach or learn using a CLIL approach?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of emphasis on what students get, and there's been recent, I mean, when CLIL was adopted, it kind of grew in popularity based on look what the students can do, and there's a lot of support about students can achieve content aims and language aims if we balance them and support both of them. And it was all about kind of student achievement, and research in more recent years has looked at the teachers and what they can or can't do in those situations. And some trends that I've noticed and have experienced myself are the fact that content teachers are often thrown into teaching in a different language very quickly and with little support. So this happens more often in university settings where it's like, hey, we're going to offer these courses in English. Starting this fall, your your sociology course needs to be in English. And the teacher says, well, I only have a B1 level. That's going to be pretty difficult for me. And the students only have an A2 level. So how much sociology are they going to get? And so the choice to do that puts teachers in an awkward spot, in a challenge. So they get a lot of short-term training, where they might say, okay, come to this workshop or work on your English, right? They might say to take IELTS courses to improve your language testing, kind of proficiency by standardized test. And that in an EMI model tends to be it, right? There's not the CLIL support for then how do you do it? If you're one of those teachers who is like, you're thrown into an EMI context, and then CLIL might be support for you, you still have the question of how. I mean, there are a plethora of frameworks that are out there. Coyle's framework about the 4 C's of CLIL is that we should focus on content, which is we talked about, communication, which is kind of the language part of it, cognition, so teacher understanding and student understanding of the language, and culture. And that by embedding those four, you can achieve, a balanced CLIL model. That's helpful. I think it's kind of abstract. I found, another text by Ball and colleagues talking about principles of CLIL, and they are all language-based instruction. Like they're things that I learned through communicative language teaching training back when I first started teaching. They're things that are embedded in task-based language teaching as core philosophies of most modern language teaching curricula. These principles kind of translate into content-based classes by supporting language development. I think that's the key that's missing. Language teachers, I think, are well equipped to take care of student needs and might need to add content to get it more engaging. CLIL often, as I said before, is an add-on to support language development in content courses. And so Ball talks about mediating language between the learner and new knowledge. So if you're going to give students new knowledge, recognize that they need language to access that new knowledge. So the teacher mediates between the language that the student knows and the knowledge that they're supposed to get. That isn't new for a language teacher, right? Like in order to do a thing, if I'm a, right, but for a content teacher, thinking about specific language might be a new thing. And so it's a big tension is what kind of teacher are you, right? Are you a content teacher or are you a language teacher? Because most people are one or the other, right? And so these principles like develop subject language awareness, planning with language in mind, carrying out a language audit of your curriculum. Like, here's your curriculum. What do they need? Like, look at it and kind of write out the language objectives for it. Making academic language explicit, right? If you're going to start teaching in English, like teach the language of the classroom, and then giving students thinking time, initial talking time, these like think, pair, share, which is, just a cornerstone of language pedagogy, in my opinion, right? Give a task, let the student think, talk to a partner, and then before they ever share out more publicly, do some private thinking.
Mm-hmm.
These are like the main, principles of some CLIL-oriented training books. And so what it tells me is that language teachers will be very well prepared to teach in a CLIL model, because all it means is supporting language while embedding it in a content focus. The real struggle I see is when content courses are said, now you have to teach in English, and they say, well, I'm not an English teacher, right? It can be the same content, language teachers being told, now you have to teach a biology course. They'll say, I don't know anything about biology. So
Exactly.
having a disciplinary identity as either a specialist, like a mathematics teacher, or an English teacher means that it's hard to balance those. So a big benefit to it, I know that's a challenge, and maybe you didn't ask, but I'm an optimist, and so I think about the benefit of that, is that you have to then collaborate, right? Like if you are a really staunch physics teacher asked to teach in English, you might want to find some English teacher friends because they've been doing that for a long time, and the collaboration. And that's, a recent piece that I came out and that I co-authored with Peter DaCosta is out in RELC this last summer. And it was all about what are the benefits of teacher collaboration, trying to navigate a CLIL environment for the first time. And it was exactly that case where the instructor needs to teach in English but has lower proficiency, and the tag team between the content instructor and the language instructor not only gave the content instructor a whole lot of confidence and new ideas for teaching kind of communicatively in a classroom, but it also helped them navigate other constraints that they had in their kind of situation. And so teacher collaboration is a huge part of a CLIL approach. It's not something that one teacher can do alone, but it's something that a school or a department can do as we make connections between content expertise and language expertise.
Yeah, this sounds like a very interesting paper. Maybe we need to meet one more time to just talk about this paper.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Montgomery. This was really interesting and informative and educational. And I'm sure that our viewers will really benefit from your discussion about CLIL. Thank you so much, and I hope that we invite you in the future for more discussions. It's always a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a real blast.
Thank you.